politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hey, thanks, Trey. It's good to be back.
Yeah, we've had a little bit longer of a hiatus because I was out in the backcountry away from the internet and enjoying trail running and all kind of funness on my part. I don't know what you've been up to on your additional week off. But
yeah, not that much. We law school, we have takes us a little longer to grade papers, so I've mostly been grading through May, and I'm just getting done now.
Yeah. See, I had put the papers behind me. I haven't put everything behind me. I'm the chair of our department, and so there's always a little bit of work. And
Right.
Administrators always tell you that it's non-existent, and then it's just like a little trickle that continues indefinitely for the rest of your life. Something like that. No, I love what I do. He said to make himself feel better. No, that's really depressing today. No, I do. I'm just coming down from not being in the wilderness. I like being out. I love running and trail running, and so I'm enclosed at the moment. So I got to get used to walls again and that kind of stuff. But what I will say is that we came back. I don't even know how to put this, Ken, to be real honest, but you know, there's weeks when we do the show and I think, man, we really need to dig into some kind of deep policy stories or things that have flown under the radar because there's not lots of big things going on in the country. And then you have weeks like this week where it feels like everything is happening simultaneously and that we have a number of really big issues that are kind of intertwining with one another. And you kind of wonder even where to start and what to add. And that's kind of how I feel this week. And what I thought we might start with is really the tragic death of George Floyd. And I think most listeners probably have a little bit of an idea of what's been going on with this. But I'm going to put it into context because every time that I look at this, there's another angle to think about from my own point of view. And so to kind of give this a little bit of context so we can dive in and talk about it. Earlier this week, an officer in Minnesota, Derek Chauvin, killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck while George, just tragically pled for his life. And the event is, for better or for worse, captured on video. And the tension following the release of that video has been building and building, especially given that this is not an isolated incident of the killing of an unarmed African-American man this year. And worse yet, it's just heartbreaking to watch George as he just simply repeats that he can't breathe, that he's dying, and then die. And so now what we have is we have protests occurring. Now what follows up with this in the wake of the protests is the police have a pretty violent confrontation with some pretty non-violent protesters, shooting rubber bullets into them. And this really hits at the heart of something we talked about 4 weeks ago when we were talking about armed white protesters in the Capitol in Minnesota, which led to no police response. And on our Reddit, Mike had actually asked, rhetorically, what would happen if African Americans had behaved under similar circumstances? Because it was something that the two of us had talked about, Ken. And he argued that would have gone badly. And I don't think any of us really disagreed, but I don't think any of us necessarily would have thought the scope to which he was right. This is clearly the case, and it's really kind of added fuel for the fire because now you have this very straightforward juxtaposition between what happens to the protesters for George Floyd and the protesters over COVID lockdowns. Now, this then even gets another bit of an angle because into all of this comes to another ongoing feud, and we're going to talk more about this feud later in the show, between Trump and Twitter or social media in general, but specifically in his case, Twitter. As the protests have continued, President Trump on Twitter vowed to send in the National Guard at the request of Democratic Governor Tim Walz. And at the end of his tweet, he uses this very loaded phrase, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end quote. And that's a language with a big racist past to it. Twitter identified the tweet as violating the rules about glorifying violence and has graded out, although it's still there to be viewed if you want to click through on it. We'll talk more about that kind of the side of the feud, but it's worth pointing in here today. We're going to see what happens today. That curfew is going to be going into effect. The National Guard has been called out and will be on the street. Making matters worse, early on Friday morning, police arrested a CNN crew live on air for really apparently no reason that I could ascertain or anyone else could, and CNN protested it. And then right here on Friday afternoon, the officer Derek was finally charged with third-degree murder. Third-degree murder is kind of a weird thing, something we might talk more about as well, Ken. A little bit more familiar with it because it's both in Minnesota and in Florida. But statutorily, third-degree murder is where you have a killing, quote, with the intent to effect the death of any person, end quote, but one causes that death by, quote, perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and with a depraved mind without regard for human life, end quote. So it's kind of a weird, and this is kind of problematic because the assumption here is kind of a really low degree charge for murder, and the other officers involved, there's nothing to be said. I mean, it's a sad day on kind of all of the fronts, and there's a lot to be talked about here. So, Ken, with that kind of setup there, where do you going to want to start with this?
Oh boy, there's so many aspects of this that you just talked about. I guess because I do teach law, I would clarify one thing. Just about, not that it's that important, but the language that you read about the third degree murder charge, that's often phrased in many states as being somebody dies because the perpetrator has had a reckless disregard for safety or for human life. And I think that probably does actually fit what happened here. I think a higher charge, a first or second degree charge, would imply that the perpetrator actually intended the death of the victim. And I'm not sure we can say that that's provable. But I think probably it would be provable that there was a reckless disregard for the life of the victim. And so I don't have any objection to the third degree murder charge. I wasn't sure if you were saying you thought that was too low of a charge.
To be honest, that's something I'm still kind of mulling around myself, but I am sure that is not going to be seen positively, especially in light of the other officers not yet facing any kind of ramifications given the circumstances. And so at the moment, that's my only intention. Yeah, I
agree with you there. Politically, it's going to look like too low of a charge to a lot of people. But I think legally, if the prosecutor charged at a higher level, the prosecutor would then have to prove that the officer intended the death of the victim. And I think that would be maybe biting off a little bit more than what a prosecutor could actually deliver on. So that's why I'm not as bothered by the charge.
I think the where it is going to be problematic is that I think most people's response to watching the video is he has to be trying to kill this guy to be killing George because, this guy is kind of pleading for his life and this guy just keeps bearing down on him and bearing down. How can he not be intending to kill him? I think that's going to be the viewpoint, when you're just watching just the video. And that's where I think you're going to have. So I don't disagree with you. I mean, the law in Minnesota is pretty clear here. It's without the intent to affect the death of a person is the way Minnesota puts it. Which you're right is different than, say, I think the language you're using there is almost straight from the Florida statutes, if I recall properly. But
reckless disregard is the standard language, and Minnesota's a little bit using slightly different phrasing, but it's the same idea. Yeah. So I think other aspects of this that are interesting. One thing you talked about, which I thought was very on point and interesting, was you see some different responses from the police when you have a group of unarmed, largely African-American protesters than what we saw in Michigan when you had armed, mostly white protesters. And one thing I wanted to add to that was that actually I think you also saw different kinds of responses from counter-protesters. So, in Michigan, where all these armed, where the armed white protesters showed up, I think they really significantly intimidated a lot of people. Nobody would have really tried to start any kind of violence or mischief around, all these armed protesters. Whereas I think there is some evidence in Minneapolis. There's a video that's been going around today. You might have seen outside of an AutoZone store where it actually looks as though it's more of a white masked counter
breaking the windows as he walks by.
Yeah, in order to kind of start stuff. That there's people showing up there who are not in sympathy with the protesters and who are actually trying to discredit the protests and make them seem violent by just starting kind of low-level violence. And I think that led to in the AutoZone case, it's just property damage, but the idea that it was actually maybe outside provocateurs who weren't part of the protests that started that kind of low-level law breaking, I think contributed to why the whole scene spun out of control as fast as it did.
Well, and you can't. I mean, I don't care how strong of kind of a law and order person you want to be. On the first evening of protests, you have a clear show of force with tear gas, rubber bullets, in a way that is unnecessary. And the best read that I can have on this is that you have really angry police officers who are the best read is that they're upset that they're in an untenable position, and at worst they're upset because their actions are too easily now recorded and disseminated. But even if you're not going to have outside influences, as you're talking about, it's difficult to say, this is just happening in the past couple of days. I'm not really sure we're going to be able to decide what's happening there. But I think we can say, and one of the things we got to be careful about is, he says, well, this is just a bunch of rioters. And the answer is really no. On day one, this was not a bunch of rioters. What you see happening now is clearly a response to what happens on day one with the police response. I don't think you disagree with me on that one.
No, I do agree. I guess maybe the reason I was also thinking about the role of outside provocateurs, though, we actually had a parallel event here in Kentucky yesterday. In Louisville, yeah. So there was a young woman named, I think, Breonna Taylor, a young African-American woman. Police came into her home and shot her. Essentially for no real reason. They actually were in the wrong home, so they thought they were executing a warrant on someone else's home. They entered into the wrong home. They shot and killed a young woman dead, and the people in the apartment had absolutely no idea what was even going on.
As a matter of fact, her boyfriend calls 911 as he's grabbing his gun to say, "We're being, somebody's breaking into our house."
Yeah. And so this was another of these type of really unjustified police killings, similar to the one that's been getting a lot more attention in Minnesota. And in Louisville last night, there was a big protest like the one in Minnesota. And actually, the police were reasonably well behaved at this one. But what happened was counter protesters showed up and shot seven of the protesters, including shot one of them dead. 6 of them are not dead. And so I feel like that, to me, that's a big part of the story. Maybe it's partly because I'm looking at the Louisville story at the same time I'm looking at the Minnesota story. But I think, in Minnesota, there's, definitely police misconduct or apparent police misconduct, as you're pointing out. In Louisville, I'm not sure that's true. But in Louisville, there's very violent counter protest to what was actually a nonviolent protest against the police.
Well, and this leads me kind of a question I have for you, one that I think that many want to put out there, and that is they want to see the story in terms of it's a militarization of the police hard stop period problem. What do you say to people whose argument is, look, this isn't really about race. This is about police overreach. Because that is making the rounds, definitely. And I'm curious about your take on that response, especially in light of you're talking about counter protesters.
Yeah, well, I think it's about both. I do think it's more about race than about police overreach, because I don't think you do see police overreaching like this in analogous situations where the protesters are white. That was really the beginning of when we were talking about the Michigan protests. But you could look back to things like the Bundy protests out on the federal land in Oregon. I think you don't see the police overreacting as much if race isn't a factor. But I also think it's true that the militarization of police forces contributes to this, and that the Minneapolis police force wouldn't have been in a position to overreact the way we've been talking about if they hadn't been so militarized, both in terms of the technology that they have and in terms of the psychology of how they think about these kind of problems. But yet, in Louisville, I know that the police shooting that started the whole issue in Louisville was a bad police mistake that spun really out of control. But I don't think there's much evidence of police really over policing those protests last night. It really seems like the violence that happened there was more because there were violent counter protests.
Yeah, I mean, there were reports in the Louisville case that there had been kind of paintball or what's called pepperball fire into crowds as things were going on. But yeah, no, again, is the best that I think we can tell at the moment. There seems to be a difference between those two. And that brings us to kind of another contour of this question. And that is, in this show, we're always talking about American politics and policy. That's part of our show headline. But really, when you start talking about things like police, and we were chatting about this, and we're talking about the language for third-degree murder, we're really talking about state issues, because police forces are different based on the state that they're in. Do you think this is also demonstrating kind of the problems and fissures in Minnesota specifically? Because again, you're kind of juxtaposing that with Kentucky.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I'm actually, I've only been to Minneapolis a couple times in my life. I'm certainly not an expert in the culture out there. The impression I have from a distance is that, it's a Democratic state. It has a Democratic governor. It has a Democratic mayor. I would not think that, it's not who I would expect to be. The elected officials are not the ones that I would expect to be encouraging this kind of police response. But I don't know. I don't know enough about. And the governor, I guess, is African American himself, and a Democrat.
Yes.
I don't know why he would be. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any reason to think that he's encouraging the police to crack down in these kind of ways on communities. But I just don't know enough. But it does probably seem to me that it would be more, that there's aspects of police culture, and especially of police culture in big city police forces sometimes that are maybe more nationally uniform and maybe not as subject to regional variation. But I'm really just speculating. What do you think about that, Trey?
Well, the reason I bring that up is, we have Governor Tim Walz is the Democratic governor in Minnesota. And he is the one who reaches out to Donald Trump. He is the one who'll be sending in ultimately the National Guard, because he's the one who called it out. And so, he has to recognize when he reaches out to President Trump that there's an inherent risk. And I've been pondering and thinking about, well, why? I understand on the one sense there's kind of an immediacy desire for peace. But on the other, you would think that he, as you'd put it, might be in a situation to be maybe even more sympathetic. I don't know.
I would have thought so. I don't know why he hurried. Maybe he just panicked. that's another possibility, too, that he really thought his city was going to spin out of control and he needed to establish order. But it doesn't seem to me like a wise move. I think he really upped the ante in ways that don't seem wise to me, but I don't fully understand his thinking here.
Well, and to kind of now circle into the conversation with President Trump, right? So President Trump, yes, immediately he's jumping on board with this. He seemed to, for the first time, to have some sympathy for George Floyd's family and for what had occurred. And then he uses that phrase, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end quote. Which is, again, we'll talk more about the content of Twitter and how that has related. But to the best of my ability here at, going on 5 o'clock Eastern time, I haven't seen Governor Walz respond or have any comments about that language, which I think is also, I mean, you think that he would want to distance himself a little bit from that, but that certainly hasn't occurred yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I know he gave a press conference about noon today, and I didn't see it or hear it, so I can't speak to what Governor Walz said. But it may be best for him to ignore Trump. I'm not sure. I think he needs to respond to it. I think Trump is just trying to throw gasoline onto a fire here and to use this as a kind of a racially divisive dog whistle. And there may just be no benefit to anybody really engaging with that.
Now, right now we have things going on. We don't know what's going to happen overnight. We don't know what's going to happen in the morning. But one of the things that I had noticed was, did you watch the CNN stream of the team being arrested?
I didn't actually watch the stream. I read a news article about it.
Well, it was funny because my wife, one of the first things she asked me was, well, who were the officers who arrested? Because it's an African-American reporter who's initially arrested as the whole team is getting arrested. And she asked me, she said, well, what were who were the police officers? And even as I've rewatched it, I couldn't tell you because they're all geared up in effectively Army gear.
Yeah.
And
who they were and why they arrested the reporters.
Yeah, you can't even. I mean, you for a couple of them, I couldn't even tell you what race they were. If you were to say, well, were they African American? Were they white? Well, I don't know. You can't see. They even have masks on. And I think that was, for me, part of kind of the disconcerting nature. We've had a long conversation on this show about the two of us between some of the norms about journalistic integrity. We see this maybe coming into a little bit of a battle in our second story here in a minute. But in some ways, it almost kind of gave a face to the worry that I think has sometimes just been a hypothetical worry about the objectivity of media when you have police officers just pulling them over, arresting them, what might happen tonight with National Guard members. What do you think about how this impacts people's... I mean, because again, we're moving into an election season. How does that impact that? Not to be crass, but it's an important question.
Well, I think how people are going to view police arresting journalists, I think they're going to view it through the prisms of their own preconceptions about police and journalists, right? So I think there's definitely some people who are always going to be happy to see police arresting journalists because they like police and they don't like the mainstream media. I think there's going to be other people who see that as a real affront against democracy and against the idea of police being public servants who should be held accountable. And I'd put myself more on that side, but I don't know that there's going to be many people whose minds are changed by that. I think a lot of people, when they watch that, it's going to make them feel affirmed in what they already thought about police and what they already thought about journalists, would be my sense. Do you think differently than that?
It's just both of those for me are just such vivid pictures. And if there's one thing that's kind of in my radar of research is I think sometimes it's those kinds of vivid moments that are the most likely to have behavior change and or position changes. And so I just wonder how those, George's killing and then the arrest, those are just really powerful images in a way that I don't think you make arguments for. I think they are much more emotional, and I think that's the level at which most people make kind of their decision-making process. So I am a little bit interested to see. I'm not sure if it would be business as usual, but you bring up a good point in the sense of, well, maybe you see that and you say hurrah because it's CNN getting in the way of a riot. I guess I can't.
Yeah, I think that's how, if President Trump hasn't tweeted that already, I'm sure that's going to be his take on it. And I think a lot of his followers, will agree with that. I guess so. If I'm hearing you right, you're suggesting that if anyone's going to have their minds changed by this, it's going to be conservatives who tend to be pro law and order, that they may look at this and think, maybe I should rethink how much I admire police, or how much I disrespect media, and recalibrate that.
Yes,
you're not thinking it's going to be on the other side. Yeah, you're not going to think it's not going to be liberals saying, "Oh, now that I can see that the police are maintaining law and order, I should have more respect for police." So maybe that'll happen. But I'm a little more skeptical than you. I mean, I think there's a constituency who doesn't like the media, and that constituency overlaps a lot with people who like police. And I don't know how many of them. Well, I guess time will tell how many of them are going to have their minds changed by this.
No, I mean, that's true as events move quickly. Now, the last kind of part of on this is, and I don't even quite know how to phrase this, Ken, but what do you do from here? I mean, for me, I've already made my kind of position clear. But as the one element that I think is difficult here, and you were the one who kind of brought it up, is if in a democratic state this is what's happening, what does that do? In other words, does it muddy the water for Democrat elected officials to say, yeah, man, we control everything and we still can't get it right?
I'm not as bleak or pessimistic as that. I think there's success stories in police community relations in this country, and they could be in Democratic cities or sometimes in Republican cities. In fact, here in Cincinnati, where I am, in 2001, you may remember. I think you were here then.
Oh yeah, for sure.
There were big race riots in the city. It started because the police shot, in the course of a year, 7 unarmed black teenagers, and the 7th of the 7, the city erupted into riots. And after that, largely because of litigation and court supervision, the police entered into a consent decree with plaintiffs who sued because of the police violence, and it was judicially enforced by federal court, and it required a lot of reforms. And at 20 years removed, I'm going to say it's been tremendously successful. We have not had the kind of problems in Cincinnati since the police collaborative agreement went into effect under federal court supervision that this city had, not just in 2001, but for decades before that as well. So I think it's not to say that litigation is the only path to that, but I think that, in New York City, for instance, when Bill de Blasio became mayor, it wasn't really litigation, but it was just that he was the mayor and he imposed policies on the police that forced them to develop better community relations. And, de Blasio today, I suppose, is a polarizing and relatively unpopular figure, but I would have to consider that to be the very greatest success of his mayoralty, is that he's actually improved police community relations in New York, and they were pretty bad when he took office. So I don't think it's impossible, if you've got elected officials who are committed to imposing some values and some restrictions on police, or even if you've got courts that are willing to do it. I think there are known paths for how to have improvements here, and I think they can be pursued.
And that, you're kind of giving a pretty optimistic view. And one of the things that I've confronted myself with, and so I'm going to kind of confront you and convict us both maybe a little bit here, see what we say is, I mean, is it easy for us to have this conversation about that? I mean, I can just imagine one of my African-American students, for example, saying, Dr. Orndorff, the only reason you guys can even talk about this on this show and say, hey, look, maybe in 20 years things will be a little bit better, is because you're white guys who don't have to worry about it. And so I guess my question for you is, in that kind of context, in a year when we have across a number of jurisdictions this kind of behavior occurring, I mean, is this the kind of the tipping point on that front where, yeah, I mean, it's great for us to have kind of a rational policy debate about this, but because I don't have to worry about TJ getting killed by police officers as he gets bigger because of his race. In other words, so what do you say to that? I mean, in other words, I'm going to kind of attack us from the left.
Yeah, no, I think both are true. I think you and I and our children are all great beneficiaries of white privilege in this country, and it's very unlikely that either of us or any of our children are going to become victims of police violence or anything like that. But I don't think that even if that's true, I don't think it means that problems for African Americans are insoluble. With Cincinnati, I wasn't talking about 20 years from now. I was talking about 20 years ago.
Oh, no, I know, but I'm thinking like from the point of view of the person in Minnesota saying, oh, good, another 20 years, and I'll be able to maybe look back, right?
Yeah, but Cincinnati looked exactly 20 years ago, like Minneapolis looks today, and it became possible after that. Immediately after that, really, because in the aftermath of the big race riots that happened here after all the police shootings in 2001, there was. Within only a few months, litigation led to this consent decree, and the consent decree has been enforced. And so I think reform came fairly quickly. It came in response to a tragedy. And I think, in Minneapolis, there's a tragedy now. But there could be reform in response to that tragedy. And it could be imposed by the governor or the mayor, or it could be imposed by courts. I think it's there has to be will. Any place in the country, there's not going to be change unless there's will to make change. But I think in places in the country, and it's been a bit of a patchwork, there has been positive change. And Martin Luther King Jr. said that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think that's true. I mean, things could go faster or slower. And in different localities, things can go faster in some localities than others. But I do think people have their consciousness raised by the types of episodes that we're seeing this week, and that at least creates conditions where positive change is possible.
So for once, I think you're actually outflanking me on the positive side, Ken. Normally it's the other way, right? I'm being too optimistic about this. And in this case, I think we reversed roles. I will say kind of maybe in closing on this that personally, I am tired of teaching introductory American government classes and having to try to assist my African American students in the system in a way that just disgusts me. And as a matter of fact, this past semester, I had an instance of a student who was asking me questions about, well, how should I interact? We were doing kind of basic introductory. It's just an introductory class in law and police enforcement, and I'm not gonna lie to students about the reality of the universe they lived in. And in this particular student's case, my answer is like, look, if you do it that way, you're going to get shot. And I'm tired of that universe. But I don't know how much that adds to anything other than to say that I'm tired of it. This week, an item that would normally be getting a lot more attention, I think, has been downplayed in part because of the tragic killing in Minnesota. Yet the two stories are intertwined. And I've already mentioned this, has been President Donald Trump's feud, I think, for a lack of a better word, with Twitter. This week, Donald Trump signed an executive order in what he called preventing online censorship. So how did this come about? Let me kind of set this up. This week, President Donald Trump tweeted that mail-in voting would lead to an increase in the amount of fraud, a claim that he has made repeatedly and for which there simply is no evidence. In response, in a historic move in the U.S. at least, Twitter did what many have hoped they would. They included a fact-checking link on his tweet to information on how mail-in voting has been studied and the minimal amount to no amount of voter fraud that mail-in voting has caused. As a matter of fact, both President Trump and many in his White House are serial mail-in voters, you might put it themselves. But as a result of that fact check, later Trump would promise, again on Twitter, action against social media platforms, and the result is the executive order that was signed on Thursday. The executive order has three really important parts. Section 1 is effectively an argument that the First Amendment ought to apply to social media companies, and that when they, quote, handpick the speech that Americans may access and convey on the internet. They cease functioning as passive bulletin boards and ought to be treated as content creators, end quote. It goes on to argue that the president has made his commitment to free and open debate on the internet a capstone of his presidency, and that it's a capstone of democracy, and that social media flagging content is inappropriate. Or, even more importantly, when, quote, Twitter now selectively decides to place a warning label on certain tweets in a manner that clearly reflects political bias, end quote, something has to be done. Well, what's the something has to be done? That's the sections 2 and 3 of the executive order. And this is really where the real meat come out. I think, Ken, we're going to spend the bulk of our time. In effect, they want to overrule the Communication Decencies Act, Section 230. In the words of William Barr, Section 230 should only apply to companies that are neutral. They keep talking about in terms of a bulletin board, and not to those that restrict access to content. When it restricts his access to content, it becomes a publisher, and by extension, should be liable for the purpose of torts. In other words, civil lawsuits. Section 3 might even be viewed a little bit more chillingly in that it wants federal agencies to review spending on these platforms, basically a threat, a not-so-veiled threat to withhold monies if the platforms are not doing what the White House wants, and that is not fact-checking. As I already noted, Twitter then today, on Friday, labeled President Trump's tweet to be glorifying violence, putting it behind a kind of a hazy mix that you have to click on to get through, suggesting that it is negative, and therefore, I think, responding in large part to the executive order from yesterday. While this might be the case on Twitter, Facebook is taking a different tact. In an interview on Fox News, clearly targeting the president, in my opinion, Facebook President Mark Zuckerberg said, quote, I just believe strongly that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth of everything people say online, end quote. Ken, there is a lot to break out here in this executive order, and clearly both politically and legally. So what's your take on this spat? That's what I'm going to call it.
Yes, I'd like to start legally. Legally, I think like almost everything else that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth, this is kind of a big con or a big hoax. I think a big hype. It's political. There's virtually no legal significance to this order, and people have been talking about the order in terms of that it's unconstitutional. It goes against the First Amendment. It goes against the Communications Decency Act itself, and I've been hearing a lot of that kind of commentary. And as far as I can tell, when I read the order, it actually doesn't do anything. So it's just 100% hype and no operative part. And I don't think it's unconstitutional. I don't think it goes against the statute. I think it just literally does nothing. And the reason that I think that primarily Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which the order talks about a lot, is a statute that says that websites that host content that's provided by third parties are not liable for the content that the third parties post there. So, in other words, Facebook is not liable for content that its users post. Twitter is not liable for content that its users post. But the Communications Decency Act also says, and always has said, that immunity doesn't apply if those websites post their own content, right? So if anyone posts on Twitter, Twitter's not responsible for that. But if Twitter puts its own content up on Twitter, then Twitter is responsible for its own content that it's putting up on Twitter. So that's also always been part of the Communications Decency Act. So if Twitter puts up corrections or amendments or commentary on President Trump's tweets, which it's been doing and which has been aggravating him so much, well, they never would have had any immunity from liability for that. If they actually put up something that's defamatory and it's Twitter's own content, it's not content provided by a third party, then they always would have been subject to being sued for defamation. So it's just the ordinary libel law, ordinary invasion of privacy laws, ordinary copyright infringement laws, any kind of illegal content If Twitter itself puts it up on its own site, it never had any immunity. It only has immunity for content that other people put up. And so when Trump says in this executive order, I'm going to take away the immunity that Twitter had under Section 230 when it puts up corrections of my tweets, well, Twitter never did have any immunity for that. That's Twitter's own content. So I think that's the main part of the executive order, and I don't think it makes any changes at all. The other part of the executive order, which I think also doesn't really make any changes at all, is he tries to bring the Federal Trade Commission into this and to say he's ordering that the Federal Trade Commission should look into whether it's a deceptive trade practice if a site like Twitter or Facebook says in its terms of service, we don't take down content based on its political content, and then they do, whether that's a form of false advertising. Now, again, that's kind of a nothing burger, because it always would have been the case that if they were promising something in their terms of service that they weren't complying with, that could have been a FTC violation. They never had any immunity from that. But also, they aren't in fact promising anything in their terms of service that they're not complying with. So again, I think both of the main operative parts of the order just simply explain what the law already is and don't do anything else at all.
Now, what is your take, though? Here's what I'm considering, and that isn't that this is unconstitutional otherwise, but rather that Trump is setting up an opportunity to sue Twitter personally. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but he doesn't have that opportunity. I mean, I think he's setting up an opportunity to have it look for his base like he's going to sue Twitter. If he actually sued Twitter for anything that they've done, they don't have immunity from that suit. But they would win that suit so easily, they'd probably be able to get sanctions against him for bringing such a frivolous suit, because they haven't done anything that violates any law. And therefore, if he says, well, I'm reminding you that you don't have immunity and I can sue you, then he's saying he could file a frivolous lawsuit against them. And if he did, then, so what? I mean, they'd get it dismissed. They'd get sanctions against his lawyers. He'd have to pay their attorney's fees. Nothing in this order changes any of that.
But again, I mean, that has been, when you take a look at President Trump pre-being president, it seems that his strategy is always to sue things. And so while I think maybe you might be giving the, hey, here's what's going to happen as a legal expert, I mean, this seems to be the world is a hammer and lawsuits are, maybe the other way, the world is a nail and lawsuits are the hammer for President Trump. So do you really think he's thinking about this as rationally as you're putting it out there? Or?
No, I'm not saying that. He might well sue them, but I'm saying he could have sued them yesterday before he put this executive order out, and he could sue them tomorrow after he put this executive order out. And either way, it's a frivolous suit that's going to be dismissed. There was nothing stopping him from bringing that suit before. There's nothing stopping him from bringing that suit now. The executive order doesn't change anything, and it doesn't give him any more chance of having the lawsuit be seen as non-frivolous.
So do you think then that this is simply an election plea, a get tough, a hope that he'll change the behavior of social media companies if they are scared of him? What do you think the real goal here is?
Yeah, I think you hit all of them, actually. I think in his heart of hearts, he hopes he can intimidate them into not putting correctives on his tweets. That's not going to happen. He's not going to intimidate them. I think maybe his other thing that he's going for is that he thinks this will play well with his base, because they like him to be kind of a bully like this, and they like him to be a puncher. And, so I think, he may get that benefit from it. One benefit he's definitely not going to get. He's not going to have any impact on Twitter's behavior, and he's not going to win any lawsuits. And his agencies are not going to bring any enforcement actions, because nothing in the executive order changes any law that's relevant from the way it was the day before the executive order. And there's no relevant law that would enable him to win any lawsuits. And Twitter and Facebook and those kind of platforms, Google maybe, they have good lawyers, they have resources, and they're not going to be intimidated by this nonsense.
So then what do you make of Mark Zuckerberg clearly going on Fox News for the first time in history to talk to the president and say, we're not going to do the thing you're asking us not to do?
Yeah, I don't think it's because he's intimidated. I think it's because he's the type that likes to curry favor and to stay out of political controversies. And another thing Zuckerberg did, I don't remember if he said this on Fox News or if he said this before that, but he actually offered to let the government decide what things should be taken down from Facebook and what things should be kept up on Facebook, and to absolve Facebook of any private responsibility for making those decisions. And again, you could ask, well, why would Zuckerberg do that? But I think he just looks at that as he's just trying to extricate himself from controversies for reasons that maybe it's his personality. He doesn't want to be in these controversies, or maybe he thinks it's good business. He doesn't want to be a villain of the right or the left, and he's looking for ways to pass the buck to somebody else. But I don't think any of that has to do with him being legally intimidated. I think all of it has to do with a combination of his personality and his business strategy.
So now here, this is a broader question dealing with the executive order. One of the other things that I see here, and I've seen it kind of thrown around a little bit, and that has been that it is anybody even before now should be aware that Donald Trump takes anything that questions the words that fall from his mouth as anything but gospel, as an evil human being, a bad, dirty, or rotten person, and so he's going to do something about it. And, a couple of years ago, I don't think that I would have seen myself asking this question. But do you think that you see in this executive order the seeds for a president who would make the case that he is not going to give up power?
See, I can't stop looking at this executive order through the lens of telecommunications law, and it is such a transparent hoax to me. It's such a Wizard of Oz that questions of the form that you asked. Does this mean that he's going to actually be real and mean things that he says, or even mean things that go beyond what he says? No, I see no evidence of that. I think he's he'll say anything. And with no regard for whether he can actually implement it or whether he's going to do anything. Now it's a separate question. What might he want to try to find a way to stop elections from happening? I think he'd like to find a way if he could. I don't think he could find a way. I think a lot of his rhetorical strategy against mail-in voting and things like that, which might be more on point than the Twitter order, is really not that he thinks he can stop it, but rather that he thinks that when he loses these elections, he can then claim that it was dishonest and rigged and stolen. I think that's a real concern, which all relates to him, just the way he tries to spin things. But I don't think he's got any possible way he could actually stop any election from taking place.
I know I don't disagree with you. And further, I guess I'm asking some of those questions because I don't disagree with you on the side here that I don't think any of the law is fundamentally changed. I don't think Barr, when he obviously his underlings drafted this, were attempting to do so. But 3 3/4 of the way through,
Yeah.
Term 1, it does appear to be a trend to me as a scholar that it is in his meaninglessness that he often is conveying his most direct meaning. I think that's what I actually said and meant.
I do agree with that. I think if your first question was, does this mean that he wants to stop the 2020 election from taking place? Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's what he wants. I just think he has. It's not realistic. It's not possible. He's got no tools to do that. And I think the rhetorical tools that he uses all the time, they can't stop an election, but they can throw a lot of shade on the validity of the election. I think that's what he's really gunning for.
So the hope is to have the election just not have meaning in that sense, and therefore he can claim a moral victory no matter what happens. I think he's thinking that maybe he can get more than a moral. Maybe when he actually loses the election and claims that it was stolen and rigged and he lost it because of fraud. Maybe he's hoping somehow that there'll be some kind of some resolution that somebody can jump in
whether it's the Supreme Court or whether it's the U.S. Senate or whether it's the Army, that someone can jump in and actually say he's still president because the election was stolen. Maybe he's holding some hopes out that something like that could happen. That's not part of our ordinary constitutional process, but I don't see any way he could stop an election from happening. And I think a lot of what he's been trying to do is just set up a predicate to try to discredit it after the fact and then see what happens.
Yeah, now that I can't. While I don't disagree with you, I guess I have become more. I don't know. I'm more skeptical of the extent to which he will take actions. But once again, maybe you're being more optimistic to me.
Well, let me before we leave the topic, let me throw it back at you then. What do you think he could do that could stop an election?
Well, as a guy who studies the presidency, one of the things that is often thrown around, especially in kind of historiographies, is, well, what happens if a president just doesn't leave? What if a president won't go? We've never experienced that before. And there's been a lot of discussion and what if scenarios. But really, because we're trying to be scientific, you can't really measure things that have never happened. They kind of hang out there as maybes. And so maybe I think I probably fixate on that a little bit more recently because that is something that in my field we have often wondered, well, what if a president just said, nope, not leaving? And that's one would assume that the transition of power would have to occur anyway, but we've never had a contested transition of power. And I think it's oftentimes in those moments where we lack precedent that we see the most unique or disturbing things happen because there isn't an automatic go-to. It's kind of like having a reflex, right? It just happens. You hit me in the knee and that's what happens automatically. But we don't have this for this process because it's never happened before. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Yeah. So I think that's why I focus on it. What if you have a president like Donald Trump who just said, no, as outlandish as that could be to say, well, no, well, what then is the mechanism that happens next? Right? That's why I think what lingers for me.
Right. But we still have a constitutional process where the Electoral College will meet. They will cast their votes. Their votes will be unsealed at the first meeting of the new Congress in 2021. They'll be counted and read. The Vice President of the United States, Pence, will have to declare that somebody else won the Electoral College. And there is a process there, although this has never happened since the early 19th century, where some of the electors, I guess, could be challenged within the Senate, and there'd be votes on that. But if that process plays out, then all the other institutions of government at that point will be bought into the idea that we had an election, it produced a winner, and someone else is president. And, maybe he could get the Supreme Court to intervene. Maybe he could actually try a military coup if he could get the army on his side. But I don't think he can do it without a lot of help from an institution other than the president himself that would legitimize it in some way. I just don't see how it's possible in the United States.
Now, I don't disagree with you on that front. I just worry about institutions that do not have, I'm a libertarian, and so I worry about those institutions intrinsically, but institutions that don't have highly institutionalized processes. What you're arguing effectively is that there is an institutionalized process. It's just never happened under protest before.
Well, look, in 2000, Al Gore was the sitting vice president, and the Supreme Court declared that Bush won Florida.
He still shows up.
Yeah, he still shows. Al Gore sits there in the first day of the new Congress and reads all the electoral votes, and in fact, he himself personally overrules objections from some of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus who were objecting to the Florida electoral votes being read. Gore's sitting there in the seat and overruling those objections, and he counts all the electoral votes, and he declares that that Bush is the winner. Now, I know you're saying Trump is not Gore, but Pence would be the one in that seat. And I don't love Pence, but I think for him to try to actually risk his entire career and reputation on, in view of the entire world, trying to somehow steal the electoral vote while sitting there in that first session. I don't see it. I don't know. What do you, I mean, you think, what do you think Pence would do in that situation?
Well, I see, as you say that, I think you actually are alleviating my, I can't imagine that Pence would do that. You were correct.
Yeah. I mean, Gore didn't do that. We had a similarly contested election back in 1876. So there have been a few times when there were, much more bona fide disputes about whether the election was legitimately won. Now, I don't think it's going to be that as close this time. And, maybe there will be a bona fide dispute, but I take it that all of Trump's rhetoric now is like a Hail Mary pass, that he's just preparing for a cataclysmic defeat and trying, in every way to say, there was massive widespread fraud. That would be quite different than what happened in 2000, where there was a bona fide dispute that came down to only about how to count about 500 votes.
Right.
And I think both sides were in good faith there. I don't think anybody was just, not in good faith in that argument. And it ended up getting resolved by an institution that, I think even though a lot of Democrats, including me, did not think that was the greatest Supreme Court decision, ultimately the court has the authority and the legitimacy that they were able to resolve it. And there were lingering criticisms of whether the court got the case right, but there wasn't really lingering doubt about who was president after that. Bush was able to take office, and that was closed. Also in Kentucky, you may remember last November, Bevin was talking like that. Do you remember the Kentucky gubernatorial election?
I had forgotten about that until you brought it up.
Yeah, Bevin was, he had started ahead of time trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the count in some of the urban counties. And then, in fact, it was a very close election. And Bevin was saying, he wasn't sure that there wasn't fraud and he wasn't necessarily going to step down. And he maintained that for a week or two after he lost the election. He wouldn't concede. He said he was, he thought he was the one elected. And then what happened was all of the Kentucky Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, started saying, Bevin, you lost the election. You got to step down. Mm-hmm. And then it became kind of untenable for him after that.
That is true. As a matter of fact, that is probably one of the better contemporary examples of that.
Yeah, I just think we have, I certainly agree with one of your points, which is that Trump has weakened our institutions and they're not as strong as they used to be. But I don't think they're in complete collapse. I think our, some of the most basic institutions, the Congress still meets and passes laws, right? When we just had the big, $4 trillion bailout, Trump didn't just start cutting those checks himself. Congress had to actually meet and vote and authorize all that. We're not in a complete failure of other institutions right now.
I think what I'm gonna label the title of this episode is Ken Gets Positive. Trey explores existential crisis. At
the beginning of summer vacation, I'm always in a good mood at the beginning of summer vacation.
Well, on that note, as we kind of finish up the show, one of the things that we always do, as is we do the things. What have we been watching? What have we been reading? I've done some weird things recently. I recommended some video games, some television show series from Amazon Prime. Today, I want to get back. As we had mentioned at the beginning of the show, I had been out, and as we were getting back, I've been reading. Have you ever heard? This is an old one. Desert Solitaire.
No, tell me about it.
Well, Desert Solitaire is actually written in 1971 by Edward Abbey. And he heads out into, and he works for the National Park Service for a couple of seasons out in the desert reserve, and it's this kind of semi-poetic look. It has a lot of tinges of somebody who has been steeped in 60s-isms, maybe a little bit of libertarianism, all meshed together. But it's really kind of ultimately an ode to the natural world and what we can learn about ourselves being in the natural world in a way that respects the natural world. And as an avid outdoorist, as someone who loves trail running and hiking and kayaking, and it really kind of speaks to me. And so I had, since I was not doing my normal set of things, and I knew I was going to be headed back out into the Smoky Mountain National Park, I had read Desert Solitaire, and I had never realized how cool of a book it really was. And so if you want to do just something completely different, Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey.
I did once read an Edward Abbey book. It's been a while, but when I was in college, I read The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey, which was I take it was the book that inspired the kind of environmentalist. Some would say environmentalist terrorist group Earth First. They got that idea from the Edward Abbey novel, the Monkey Wrench Gang. And I should probably read more Edward Abbey novels.
Well, in this case, just it's not a novel. This is in fact,
it's a nonfiction.
This is what he really did. He did work in a National Park Service, so it is nonfiction. It's him talking about his time being out in the desert. So this is nonfiction in this case. I should have been more explicit about this. This is not a novel. You're not going to find some gripping murder plot or anything like that. This is completely about his actual experience in the desert over the course of 3 years.
Cool.
Yeah. So what about for you? Anything I should read personally, maybe?
Maybe, although I know I always revert to type, and you know how much I love reading Cold War espionage stuff, and I was at it again. So I've just been reading this book called The Lost Spy, an American in Stalin's Secret Service. It's written by an author named Andrew Meyer, and it is about a spy named Cy Oggins. Oggins was a guy who grew up in Connecticut in the 1910s, went to Columbia University for college in New York City during the World War I era, then joined the Army and went to fight in World War I, and somewhere along the way got recruited into Stalin's Secret Service. He came in through the Comintern. He worked as a spy for international communism first through the Comintern and then for the KGB later, mostly in Europe, but he was an American. And then because some of the people that he'd worked with in the Comintern were Trotskyists, and Stalin turned against Trotsky, Stalin eventually called Oggins to Moscow, thinking that Oggins went there thinking he was going to get another assignment, but then he was sent to the Gulag, and he spent the rest of his life in the Gulag. And so I was just reading his sad story of the rewards that he got from Stalin for trying to spy for Stalin against the West. But he was one of the first American spies to spy for the Soviets.
And so is this is obviously not by him then? So this is just about him?
No, he's long dead. Yeah, he died in the 40s, but this is a recent book by an author named Andrew Meyer. And Meyer was able to write it in part by going to the Soviet Union or going to contemporary Russia and looking through archives of the former Soviet Union. And in part, Meyer was able to write it because Oggins had a son who Oggins's widow and Oggins's son stayed in the United States when Oggins went to Moscow, and so the son was very, very elderly. I think he's in his late 80s, but he was still alive. And so this author partly was able to go to Oggins's son, who'd been a professor at SUNY Binghamton, and look through whatever old materials Oggins's widow had left behind, and then also go to Russia and research it. So it's a recent book. It's all research about things that happened from about 1920 to about 1949.
Your knowledge of that era is deeply intriguing to me, Ken.
I just love Cold War espionage stuff. I love to learn as much about it as I can.
I can tell. I mean, that you whenever there's just a default, I can tell that you would just read about the Cold War all the time if it wasn't for law.
All the time. Yeah. Yep, that's right.
Oh, I used to be that way, and I had some really good friends in my life who basically said, Trey, it wasn't Cold War for me. You can't be that narrow. And so she, as a matter of fact, would continually get me different books and be like, now you're going to read some poetry. And now, and then one of the best things that ever happened to me early in my career, to have some friends who were like, no, you're going to have to read some uncomfortable stuff. But I do appreciate that you can be so on point. Anyway, that's so cool.
So monomaniacal.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, listeners, thank you so much for listening to Politics, guys. Ken, it's been wonderful doing the show with you. And here in a moment, we're going to be doing the bonus show for those of you who want to join us. But I also need to have a special kind of exit today, Ken, because this week I was talking with my brother. His name's Jeremy Orndorff. And he told me, he said, Trey, I love the politics guys and I love you, but you know that I'm poor and I'm never going to give you any money. So what do you say about that? And I said, I've never asked you for money, Jeremy. And he said, so, why do you always insist on asking people? I said, it's not just asking people for money. You can also do things like, share our episodes, rate us on iTunes and Spotify, and do that kind of stuff. And he said, the only way I'm going to do that is if you call me out by name on this show. So Jeremy Orndorff, I've just called you out by name. So I'm expecting a review of this episode, and I'm expecting you to share it with 100 of your closest friends. And for everybody else who likes the show, I ask that you do what Jeremy does, and that is share it. Even if you don't have money or the time to make the funding for this show possible, it is you sharing episodes. It's your word of mouth advertising. It really does matter the most, teasing aside. And we really do need your support. But additionally, we also need financial support. And one of the great things about being a financial supporter is you're going to get access to additional content. And one of those is our full-length supporters only Wednesday show. And that's what Ken and I are going to be taking on. And this week, we're going to be talking in part, we always seem to follow Israel, Ken. And this week, we're going to be taking a look at Netanyahu. So if you would like to know more about what we have to say about the ongoing Israeli elections and criminal trials, now is the time. And you can do that by becoming a financial supporter for the show. What you have to do is you're going to head to our Patreon page at patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go straight to politicsguys.com/support. And that way you can join myself and Ken again on Wednesday. So head to patreon.com/politicsguys and become a financial supporter so that you'll hear our bonus show on Wednesday. Even if you can't, we appreciate sharing episodes, rating us on iTunes, on Spotify, wherever you get the show. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just some random thought you'd like to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We also strive for civil and rational debate on our Reddit, Bipartisan Politics, and we're also on Twitter at Politics Guys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show was produced by myself, Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show, bonus show, on Wednesday. I hope you'll join us then.